Ma'am, I'm going to need you to move to coach. This seat is reserved for our VIP executive passenger. The flight attendant's words hung in the air like a death sentence, and I felt every pair of eyes in first class turn toward me. 24 hours ago, I was celebrating the biggest acquisition in aviation history. Now I was being told I didn't belong in the seat I'd paid for because apparently I didn't look the part. You know what they say about karma? Sometimes it doesn't wait for the next lifetime. Sometimes it shows up in 15 minutes with a corporate headquarters alert that changes everything. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor so dark, so perfectly timed, that you almost have to laugh at the beautiful destruction it creates. Hey everyone, I hope you're having a better day than the airline staff in this story are about to have. Whether you're watching this from your couch, your office, or maybe even from an airplane seat yourself, I want you to buckle up because this story is going to take you on a ride that proves sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply letting people reveal exactly who they are. My name is Ivory Ellington, and this is the story of how I went from being humiliated in front of a plane full of strangers to watching an entire flight crew realize they'd just discriminated against the woman who literally owned their jobs. Picture this: 15 minutes of the most uncomfortable silence you've ever witnessed, followed by the kind of justice that makes you believe the universe really does keep score. But before I tell you about the most satisfying 15 minutes of my professional life, let me ask you to hit that like button if you believe in karma, subscribe if you want to hear more stories about justice served cold, and drop a comment telling me about a time you witnessed someone get exactly what they deserved. But let me start from the beginning, because the setup makes the payoff so much sweeter. I was 28 when I learned that success doesn't protect you from people's assumptions about who you're supposed to be. I'd built Ellington Logistics from a single delivery truck into a billion-dollar empire, but I still looked like what I was, a young black woman who preferred jeans and sneakers to power suits and pearls. I believed that good work spoke louder than appearances. I believed that respect was earned through results, not costumes. I believed that in 2024, we'd moved past judging people's worth by the color of their skin. I was about to learn how naive those beliefs really were. The morning of the flight, I was riding high on the biggest deal of my career. After 18 months of negotiations, I'd finally convinced the board of Meridian Airlines to accept my acquisition offer. $12 billion. The kind of money that makes headlines and changes industries. I wasn't just buying an airline, I was positioning myself to revolutionize how cargo and passenger transport worked together. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was flying Meridian to finalize the paperwork that would make me their new owner. I'd specifically chosen to fly with them, to experience their service firsthand before I took control. I wanted to see what I was really buying from the ground up. I should have known that the universe was setting me up for something when everything went wrong from the moment I arrived at the airport. My usual car service was late. Security took forever. My gate changed twice. But I made it to the plane with minutes to spare, looking forward to a quiet flight where I could review the final contracts one more time. I handed my boarding pass to the gate agent, a middle-aged white woman whose smile seemed genuine enough. She glanced at my pass, then at me, then back at my pass with a slight frown. First class, she asked, like she was confirming I hadn't made some kind of mistake. Yes, I said simply. I'd learned not to over-explain my presence in spaces where people didn't expect to see me. She scanned my pass and waved me through, but I caught her watching me as I walked down the jet bridge. That should have been my first warning. The flight attendant who greeted me at the aircraft door was a tall blonde woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes. She looked at my boarding pass, then at me, with the same confused expression I'd seen at the gate. "Welcome aboard," she said, but her tone suggested I was anything but welcome. "Your seat is 2A. I made my way to first class, settling into the spacious leather seat I'd paid extra for. The cabin was filling up slowly, mostly with the usual mix of business travelers and wealthy passengers you'd expect in first class. I pulled out my laptop and started reviewing the acquisition documents, trying to ignore the way the flight attendant kept glancing in my direction. That's when he boarded. Richard Pemberton looked exactly like what central casting would order if they needed someone to play important white executive. Silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of confident stride that announced he belonged everywhere he went. He was probably in his 50s, with the soft look of someone who'd spent more time in boardrooms than gyms. I watched him scan the first-class cabin like he owned it, his eyes settling on the empty seat next to mine. Seat 2B. According to his boarding pass, that's exactly where he belonged. But apparently, the flight attendant had other ideas. She approached him with a smile that was completely different from the one she'd given me. This smile was warm, deferential, the kind reserved for people she considered important. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, reading his name from the passenger manifest. "I'm so sorry, but there's been a slight mix-up with the seating. We have you in 2B, but I think you'd be much more comfortable in 2A. It's our premium VIP seat." I looked up from my laptop, confused. "Excuse me, but I'm in 2A. The flight attendant turned to me with barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to move to coach. This seat is reserved for our VIP executive passenger." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Like I was some kind of inconvenience. Like I didn't belong there. Like the idea that I could be the VIP executive passenger was so absurd it wasn't even worth considering. "I have a boarding pass for 2A, I said calmly, holding up the pass. "I paid for the seat." She barely glanced at it. "There's been a mistake. Mr. Pemberton is our priority passenger today. I'm sure you'll be much more comfortable in coach." The assumption was so blatant, so ugly, that for a moment I couldn't even process it. She was moving me out of my paid seat to accommodate a white man, simply because she assumed he was more important than I was. She was looking at both of us and deciding that he belonged in first class and I didn't, based on nothing but the color of our skin and her own prejudices. Richard Pemberton, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. "I'm fine with 2B, he said quietly. "There's no need to move anyone." But the flight attendant was already reaching for my laptop bag. "Ma'am, I need you to gather your things. We're holding up the boarding process." That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I could have pulled out my ID. I could have explained who I was. I could have mentioned that in less than 24 hours, I would own the airline they worked for. I could have ended their careers with a single phone call. Instead, I decided to let them show me exactly who they were. "Of course," I said, closing my laptop and standing up. "I wouldn't want to cause any trouble." The relief on the flight attendant's face was almost comical. She'd expected a fight, and instead, I was making it easy for her. She had no idea she was about to make the biggest mistake of her professional life. As I gathered my things, I caught Richard Pemberton's eye. He looked genuinely sorry, but not sorry enough to refuse the upgrade he didn't deserve. He settled into my seat with the kind of guilty satisfaction of someone who knows they're benefiting from an injustice, but chooses to enjoy it anyway. The flight attendant escorted me to coach like I was some kind of security risk, her hand hovering near my elbow as if she expected me to bolt back to first class the moment she turned around. She found me a middle seat between a crying baby and a man who smelled like he'd bathed in cologne, then returned to first class to fawn over Richard Pemberton. I watched through the gap between seats as she brought him champagne and warm nuts, asking if there was anything else she could do to make his flight more comfortable. She treated him like royalty while I sat in coach, squeezed between strangers, holding the contracts that would make me his boss in less than a day. The other passengers in coach looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. They'd witnessed the whole thing, seen me get demoted from first class, and they were probably wondering what I'd done wrong. The assumption was that I must have deserved it somehow. That people like me didn't just get removed from first class for no reason. But I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was fascinated. I was watching a masterclass in unconscious bias, seeing exactly how discrimination worked in real time. These people weren't evil. They probably would have sworn they weren't racist. They were just operating on assumptions so deep, so automatic, that they didn't even recognize them as choices. The flight attendant returned to check on Richard Pemberton twice more before we even took off. She asked about his business, complimented his suit, made sure he had everything he needed. She was performing the kind of service that first-class passengers paid for, the kind of attention that made people feel important and valued. Meanwhile, she hadn't looked in my direction once since seating me in coach. As we taxied toward the runway, I pulled out my phone and opened my email. I had 17 new messages, most of them related to the acquisition. My assistant had sent me the final boarding documents. My lawyer had confirmed that all the regulatory approvals were in place. My CFO had transferred the funds to escrow. In 12 hours, I would walk into Meridian Airlines headquarters as their new owner. I would sit in the boardroom where their executives would hand me the keys to a $12 billion company. I would become one of the youngest Black women to ever control a major airline. But right now, I was just another Black woman who'd been told she didn't belong. I looked up toward first class, where Richard Pemberton was enjoying champagne that should have been mine, in a seat that I'd paid for, receiving service from people who would soon work for me. The flight attendant was laughing at something he'd said, her whole demeanor bright and engaged in a way it had never been with me. That's when I started to smile. Because in exactly 15 minutes, when we reached cruising altitude, the pilot would receive a priority message from Meridian Airlines headquarters. A message that would change everything. A message that would turn this entire flight into the most expensive lesson in unconscious bias that anyone had ever received. I settled back in my uncomfortable middle seat, closed my eyes, and started counting down. 15 minutes until justice. 15 minutes until karma. 15 minutes until everyone on this plane learned that sometimes the person you underestimate is exactly the person who controls your future. The engines roared to life, and we lifted off into what was about to become the most memorable flight of everyone's lives. The thing about building a billion-dollar company from nothing is that you learn to read people fast. You have to. When you're a young Black woman trying to convince investors to trust you with their money, every meeting is a test of whether they see your potential or just your demographics. I'd started Ellington Logistics 8 years earlier with a single delivery truck and a business plan I'd written on my kitchen table. My grandmother had left me $50,000 when she died, and instead of using it for a down payment on a house like everyone expected, I bought that truck and started delivering packages for small businesses that the big companies ignored. The first year was brutal. 18-hour days, sleeping in the truck between deliveries, living on gas station coffee and determination. But I had something the established companies didn't. I actually cared about the small businesses I served. I knew their names, their stories, their struggles. When Mrs. Mark needed her restaurant supplies delivered by 5 a.m., I was there at 4:45. When Marley needed his auto parts rushed across town, I made it happen. Word spread. Small businesses started choosing Ellington Logistics not because we were cheaper, but because we were better. We were reliable. We cared. Within 2 years, I had a fleet of 12 trucks and was hiring drivers who shared my vision of service that actually meant something. By year 4, I was handling logistics for mid-size companies. By year 6, I was competing with the national chains. By year 8, I was buying them out. The secret wasn't just hard work, though I'd certainly done plenty of that. The secret was understanding that logistics isn't really about moving packages. It's about trust. It's about being the person who shows up when they say they will, who solves problems instead of creating them, who treats every delivery like it matters because to someone, it always does. That philosophy had made me rich. It had also made me naive about how the world really worked. I'd spent so much time focused on building my company that I'd insulated myself from the daily reality of discrimination. When you're the boss, People treat you with respect because they have to. When you're writing the checks, people smile and nod and tell you what you want to hear. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be judged by strangers who saw only my skin color and made assumptions about my worth. The flight attendant's name was Jennifer Walsh, according to her name tag. She was probably in her early 40s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested she took pride in her work. Under different circumstances, I might have liked her. She seemed confident, professional, the kind of employee who made airlines run smoothly. But right now, she was treating Richard Pemberton like visiting royalty while acting like I'd somehow contaminated first class just by existing there. I watched her bring him a second glass of champagne before we'd even finished climbing to cruising altitude. She leaned in close when she spoke to him, her voice warm and conspiratorial. I hope you don't mind me saying, Mr. Pemberton, but you have excellent taste in watches. Is that a Patek Philippe? Richard smiled and extended his wrist. Good eye. It was a gift from my board when we closed our last acquisition. How exciting! What kind of business are you in? Consulting. We help companies optimize their operations, make them more efficient. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills. Jennifer laughed like he'd said something incredibly witty. I'm sure you're being modest. Anyone who flies first class regularly must be doing something right. I almost choked on my complimentary peanuts. Richard Pemberton was a mid-level consultant who probably made a decent living, but was hardly the corporate titan Jennifer was treating him like. Meanwhile, I was sitting in coach despite having built a company that generated more revenue in a month than he probably saw in a year. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was watching how the other first-class passengers responded to Jennifer's obvious favoritism. They didn't seem surprised or uncomfortable. They seemed to think it was natural. Of course, the well-dressed white man deserved special attention. Of course, he was more important than the black woman who'd been moved to coach. The passenger in 1A, an older white woman in expensive jewelry, actually nodded approvingly when Jennifer brought Richard a warm towel. The man in 1C smiled when Jennifer asked Richard about his business plans. They were all complicit in the assumption that Richard belonged there and I didn't. That's when I realized this wasn't just about one prejudiced flight attendant. This was about a system that automatically assigned value based on appearance, that made snap judgments about who mattered and who didn't. Jennifer wasn't acting alone. She was acting out the unconscious biases that everyone on this plane shared. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant, Mandy. Final documents signed and filed. Congratulations, boss. You officially own an airline. I stared at the message for a long moment, then looked up toward first class, where Jennifer was now offering Richard a selection of premium snacks. In about 10 minutes, she was going to learn that the woman she'd humiliated was now her ultimate boss. The woman she deemed unworthy of first class was about to control every aspect of her professional life. But first, I wanted to see how far this would go. I pressed the call button above my seat. It took Jennifer almost 5 minutes to respond, and when she finally made her way back to coach, her expression was one of barely concealed irritation. Yes, she said, not even trying to hide her annoyance. Could I get a glass of water, please? She sighed like I'd asked her to perform surgery. We'll be serving beverages shortly. I'm actually quite thirsty now. I have a medical condition that requires me to stay hydrated. It was a lie, but I wanted to see how she'd respond to a reasonable request from someone she'd already decided didn't matter. I'll see what I can do, she said, but her tone suggested she had no intention of doing anything at all. She returned to first class and immediately resumed her conversation with Richard, completely forgetting about my request. I watched her laugh at his jokes, refill his champagne, and ask if he needed anything else. She brought him a pillow without being asked. She offered him a selection of magazines. She treated him like her only job was making sure he was comfortable. Meanwhile, I sat in coach, still waiting for a glass of water. The passenger next to me, A middle-aged black man in a business suit leaned over and whispered, "I saw what happened up there." That was messed up. I nodded, but didn't say anything. I was too busy watching the show. Jennifer made 3 more trips to check on Richard before she finally remembered my water request. When she brought it to me, she practically threw the plastic cup onto my tray table without making eye contact. "Here," she said, already turning away. "Thank you," I said politely. "I really appreciate it." She paused, probably surprised by my gracious response. For just a moment, she looked almost guilty. But then Richard called her name from first class, and she hurried back to him like he was the only passenger who mattered. I sipped my water and checked my phone. 8 minutes until we reached cruising altitude. 8 minutes until the pilot received the message that would change everything. I thought about my grandmother, who'd cleaned houses for wealthy white families her entire life. She'd told me stories about being treated like she was invisible, about having her intelligence questioned, about being paid less than her white counterparts despite doing better work. She'd saved every penny so that I could have opportunities she'd never had. Ivory, she'd told me before she died, success isn't just about making money. It's about proving that we belong everywhere we choose to be. I'd built Ellington Logistics to honor that lesson. I'd worked twice as hard as my competitors, been twice as smart, twice as prepared, twice as professional. I'd thought that would be enough. I'd thought that success would protect me from the kind of treatment my grandmother had endured. But sitting in that coach seat, watching Jennifer fawn over a man whose only qualification was looking the part, I realized that some things never change. Success doesn't eliminate racism, it just makes it more expensive when people act on their prejudices. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from the pilot. "Priority alert from headquarters. Please contact ground control immediately upon reaching cruising altitude." I smiled. Right on schedule. Jennifer was now showing Richard the wine list, explaining the different options like he was a sommelier instead of a consultant from Ohio. She was performing the kind of service that justified first-class prices, the kind of attention that made passengers feel valued and important. She had no idea that in less than 5 minutes, she was going to learn the most expensive lesson of her career. The plane leveled off, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Flight attendants, you're now free to move about the cabin." Jennifer immediately headed to the galley to contact headquarters, probably expecting routine operational updates. I watched her pick up the phone, her expression casual and unconcerned. That expression was about to change dramatically. I settled back in my uncomfortable middle seat and waited for the show to begin. Because in about 30 seconds, Jennifer Walsh was going to discover that karma doesn't just exist in stories. Sometimes it shows up at 35,000 feet with a corporate headquarters alert that turns your entire world upside down. The woman who decided I didn't belong in first class was about to learn that I didn't just belong there. I owned the whole damn plane. I watched Jennifer's face change through the galley window as she listened to whatever headquarters was telling her. The casual confidence drained away first, replaced by confusion. Then confusion gave way to something that looked like panic. She kept asking the person on the other end to repeat themselves. I could see her mouth forming the words, "Are you sure?" over and over again. Her free hand gripped the galley counter so hard her knuckles went white. The other flight attendant, a younger man named David according to his name tag, noticed Jennifer's distress and approached her. I watched them have a hushed, urgent conversation. David's eyes went wide, and he actually took a step backward like he'd been physically struck. Then they both turned and looked directly at me. The moment our eyes met, I knew they'd figured it out. Someone at headquarters had explained exactly who Ivory Ellington was and exactly what she now controlled. The woman they'd humiliated, the woman they'd moved to coach like she was some kind of inconvenience, was their new boss. Jennifer hung up the phone with shaking hands. She said something to David that made him pale visibly. Then she started walking toward Coach, her professional composure completely shattered. But I wasn't ready for this to end yet. I had spent 8 years building a company, 8 years proving myself in boardrooms full of people who looked like Richard Pemberton, 8 years earning the right to be treated with basic human dignity. And these people had stripped that away from me in 30 seconds based on nothing but their own prejudices. So when Jennifer approached my row, looking like she was about to throw up, I pretended to be asleep. She stood there for almost a full minute, clearly trying to work up the courage to wake me. I could feel her hovering, could sense her panic radiating outward like heat. Finally, she cleared her throat softly. "Ma'am? Excuse me, ma'am?" I opened my eyes slowly, like someone who'd been genuinely sleeping. "Yes. There's been a terrible mistake. We need to move you back to first class immediately." I blinked at her with perfect innocence. "I'm sorry, what?" "I thought you said this seat was fine for me. That I'd be more comfortable here." Jennifer's face went through several shades of red. "No, ma'am. There was a misunderstanding. Your original seat is available now, and we'd like to upgrade your service to make up for any inconvenience." "Upgrade my service?" I tilted my head like I was confused. "But you told me Mr. Pemberton was the VIP passenger, that he needed that seat more than I did." The passengers around us were starting to pay attention. The man who'd whispered to me earlier was watching with obvious interest. The woman across the aisle had put down her magazine. Even the crying baby had quieted down, like the universe wanted everyone to hear this conversation. "Ma'am, please," Jennifer's voice was barely above a whisper. "We made a serious error in judgment. We'd like to correct it immediately." "What kind of error?" I asked, my voice carrying just enough to be heard by nearby passengers. "I'm just curious what changed between takeoff and now." Jennifer looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. We didn't realize who you were." "And who am I?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jennifer opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. She was trapped between admitting what they'd done wrong and trying to save face in front of a cabin full of witnesses. You're Ivory Ellington," she finally whispered. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Could you speak up?" Jennifer's voice cracked slightly. "You're Ivory Ellington, the CEO of Ellington Logistics." "That's right," I said pleasantly. "The same Ivory Ellington who was sitting in seat 2A when you decided I didn't belong there. The same Ivory Ellington you moved to Coach because you assumed Mr. Pemberton was more important than I was." "What exactly has changed?" The cabin had gone completely silent. Even the engines seemed quieter. Every passenger within earshot was staring at us, and I could see people in other rows craning their necks to see what was happening. Jennifer was crying now, actual tears streaming down her face. "Ma'am, please. We didn't know. We made a terrible mistake." "You didn't know what?" "That I was successful? That I had money? That I deserved basic respect." I kept my voice calm, conversational, but every word hit like a hammer. "Or did you just assume that someone who looks like me couldn't possibly belong in first class?" "We're so sorry." David had appeared beside Jennifer, looking equally panicked. "We want to make this right." "How?" I asked. "How do you make this right? Do you move me back to first class and pretend this never happened? Do you give me extra peanuts and hope I forget that you judged my worth based on the color of my skin?" Richard Pemberton had appeared at the edge of the coach section, drawn by the commotion. When he saw what was happening, his face went ashen. He'd enjoyed his unearned upgrade, but now he was realizing the cost. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I tried to tell them I was fine with my assigned seat." I looked at him for a long moment. "But you didn't try very hard, did you? You didn't refuse the upgrade. You didn't insist they honor my reservation. You just sat there and let them treat me like I didn't matter because it benefited you." He had no answer for that. I stood up slowly, and both flight attendants took an involuntary step backward. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the cabin. I'm going to finish this flight in the seat I paid for. And when we land, I'm going to have a very interesting conversation with your management about how Meridian Airlines treats its passengers. Ma'am, Jennifer was sobbing now. Please don't report this. I have 3 kids. I need this job. You should have thought about that before you decided I didn't deserve the seat I paid for, I replied. You should have thought about that before you treated me like a second-class citizen while fawning over a man whose only qualification was looking the part you expected. I gathered my things and started walking toward first class. The entire cabin watched in complete silence as I made my way forward. When I reached row 2, Richard Pemberton was already gathering his belongings from my seat. I'm sorry, he said as he moved to 2B. I should have spoken up. Yes, I said simply. You should have. I settled into seat 2A and pulled out my laptop. Jennifer and David stood in the aisle, clearly unsure what to do next. The other first-class passengers were staring at me with a mixture of shock and embarrassment. They'd all witnessed the discrimination, and they'd all been complicit in their silence. Ma'am, Jennifer approached cautiously. Is there anything we can get you? Champagne? A meal upgrade? I looked up at her with cold eyes. You can get me exactly what you would have given me if you'd treated me with basic human dignity from the beginning. Nothing more, nothing less. She nodded frantically and hurried away. Within minutes, she returned with champagne, warm nuts, and a selection of magazines. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly spilled the drink. Thank you, I said politely, then returned to my laptop. But I wasn't working on the acquisition documents anymore. I was composing an email to my head of human resources outlining a new diversity and inclusion training program for all Meridian Airlines employees. I was drafting a memo about unconscious bias in customer service. I was planning the complete overhaul of a company culture that had allowed this incident to happen. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every Black woman who'd been told she didn't belong. Every person of color who'd been judged by their appearance instead of their character. Every human being who'd been made to feel less than because of someone else's prejudices. Jennifer made 6 more trips to check on me during the flight. Each time, she asked if there was anything else she could do. Each time, I politely declined. I could see the fear in her eyes, the knowledge that her career was probably over. Part of me felt sorry for her. She wasn't evil, just ignorant. She'd acted on assumptions so deeply ingrained she probably didn't even recognize them as choices. But ignorance wasn't an excuse, not when it caused real harm to real people. The other passengers in first class kept glancing at me nervously. They'd all witnessed my humiliation, and they'd all done nothing to stop it. Now they were wondering if there would be consequences for their silence. There would be. As we began our descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing. Jennifer appeared at my seat one last time. Ma'am, I just want you to know how truly sorry I am. What we did was inexcusable. I looked up at her. You're right. It was inexcusable. And I hope you remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on how they look instead of who they are. She nodded, tears streaming down her face again. I will. I promise I will. As the plane touched down, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was about to be served, but it had come at a cost. People were going to lose their jobs. Careers were going to be destroyed. Lives were going to be changed forever. But maybe that's what it took. Maybe some lessons could only be learned the hard way. My phone buzzed with a message from Meridian CEO, requesting an urgent meeting as soon as I landed. He'd obviously heard about the incident and was probably panicking about the liability and public relations nightmare his airline was facing. I smiled as I gathered my belongings. In about an hour, I was going to walk into that meeting as the new owner of Meridian Airlines. I was going to sit across from executives who were probably scrambling to figure out how to apologize to the woman they'd just discriminated against. And then I was going to show them exactly what accountability looked like. The plane came to a stop at the gate, and passengers began gathering their things. Jennifer and David stood by the exit, their faces pale and drawn. They knew their careers were over. They knew they'd made the kind of mistake that couldn't be fixed with apologies and good intentions. As I walked past them toward the exit, Jennifer grabbed my arm gently. "Please," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve it, but please consider giving us another chance." I stopped and looked at her for a long moment. "Jennifer, I'm going to tell you something my grandmother told me. She said that respect isn't something you give to people because of what they can do for you. It's something you give because of what it says about who you are." I paused, letting that sink in. "You didn't respect me because you didn't think I could do anything for you. You didn't think I mattered. That says everything about who you are and nothing about who I am." I walked off the plane and into the terminal, where a car was waiting to take me to Meridian's headquarters. In 30 minutes, I would walk into a boardroom full of executives who were about to learn that the woman their employees had humiliated was now their boss. The real reckoning was just beginning. The Meridian Airlines headquarters building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel that screamed corporate success. As my car pulled up to the executive entrance, I could see people in expensive suits hurrying in and out, their faces tight with the kind of stress that comes from knowing your world is about to change. My phone had been buzzing nonstop since I'd landed. 17 missed calls from Meridian CEO, James Morrison. 12 voicemails from their head of public relations. 6 urgent emails from their legal department. They were in full crisis mode, and they didn't even know the worst part yet. They thought they were dealing with a discrimination lawsuit. They had no idea they were dealing with their new owner. I'd instructed my assistant to keep the acquisition details confidential until I arrived. As far as Meridian's executives knew, Ivory Ellington was just an angry passenger with a legitimate complaint. They were probably planning to offer me a settlement, maybe some free flights, definitely a carefully worded apology that admitted no wrongdoing. They were about to get the shock of their lives. The lobby was all marble and mahogany, designed to impress visitors with Meridian's success and stability. The receptionist, a young white woman with perfect makeup and a practiced smile, looked up as I approached. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" "I'm Ivory Ellington. I have a meeting with Mr. Morrison." Her smile faltered slightly. She'd obviously been briefed about the situation. "Of course, Ms. Ellington. Mr. Morrison is waiting for you in the executive conference room. I'll escort you up." The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, but I could feel the receptionist's nervous energy. She kept glancing at me like she was trying to figure out how much trouble her company was in. If she only knew. The executive conference room was exactly what I'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a massive table that could seat 20 people, and walls lined with awards and photos of Meridian's leadership team. All white men, I noticed. Not a single person of color in any position of authority. That was about to change. James Morrison was waiting for me with 3 other executives, the head of operations, the chief legal counsel, and the director of human resources. They all stood when I entered, their faces carefully composed in expressions of professional concern. Morrison was a tall, silver-haired man in his early 60s who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate leadership manual. His handshake was firm, his smile apologetic, but not quite genuine. "Ms. Ellington, thank you for coming. I'm James Morrison, CEO of Meridian Airlines. I want to start by saying how deeply sorry we are about what happened on your flight today." I took a seat at the conference table, noting how they'd positioned themselves across from me like we were adversaries. "I appreciate that, Mr. Morrison. Though I have to say, your apology might carry more weight if you actually knew what you were apologizing for." The legal counsel, a nervous-looking man named Peterson, leaned forward. "We've conducted a preliminary investigation into the incident. We understand that there was a seating mix-up that resulted in you being moved from first class to coach." "A seating mix-up," I repeated slowly. "Is that what you're calling it?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably. We're still gathering all the facts, but it appears there was some confusion about passenger priority status. I almost laughed. They were trying to sanitize what had happened, to turn blatant discrimination into a simple administrative error. Mr. Morrison, let me help you gather those facts. Your flight attendant, Jennifer Walsh, removed me from my paid first-class seat and gave it to a white male passenger because she assumed he was more important than I was. She told me I would be more comfortable in coach. She then spent the entire flight treating him like royalty while ignoring my basic requests for service. The HR director, a middle-aged woman named Sandra Mark, was taking notes frantically. We understand your frustration, Ms. Ellington. This kind of treatment is absolutely unacceptable, and we want to make it right. How? I asked. How do you make it right when your employees judge passengers' worth based on the color of their skin? Peterson cleared his throat. We're prepared to offer you a full refund for your ticket, plus additional compensation for the distress you experienced. We're also willing to provide you with complimentary first-class travel for the next year. I stared at him for a long moment. You think this is about money? We want to resolve this matter fairly and quickly, Morrison said. We're also prepared to ensure that the employees involved receive additional training. Additional training, I repeated. Not termination. Training. The room went quiet. They'd expected me to be angry, but they hadn't expected me to be this calm, this focused. They were used to dealing with upset passengers who could be mollified with vouchers and apologies. Ms. Ellington, Morrison said carefully, we believe in giving our employees opportunities to learn and grow from their mistakes. Their mistakes, I said. Is that what you call racial discrimination? A mistake. Sandra Mark looked up from her notes. We don't believe this incident was motivated by racial bias. Our employees are trained to treat all passengers with equal respect. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app. Do you mind if I record the rest of this conversation? For my records. The legal team exchanged panicked glances. Peterson started to object, but Morrison held up a hand. That's fine, Ms. Ellington. We have nothing to hide. I hit record and placed the phone on the table. So you're saying that when your flight attendant looked at me and Richard Pemberton and decided that he deserved my seat more than I did, that wasn't racial bias? We're saying that without a full investigation, we can't determine the motivations behind the employee's actions, Peterson said carefully. What would a full investigation look like? I asked. We'd interview all the staff involved, review security footage, examine passenger manifests, and determine if proper procedures were followed, Sandra explained. And how long would that take? Probably 4 to 6 weeks. I nodded slowly. 4 to 6 weeks to determine whether moving a black woman out of first class to make room for a white man constitutes discrimination. That seems reasonable. Morrison was starting to look frustrated. Ms. Ellington, we're trying to handle this professionally. We've acknowledged that mistakes were made, and we're prepared to compensate you fairly. What if I don't want compensation? I asked. What if I want accountability? What kind of accountability? Peterson asked warily. The kind where people face real consequences for their actions. The kind where your company actually changes instead of just offering better training. Sandra leaned forward. What exactly are you asking for? I smiled. I'm asking for you to do the right thing. Fire the employees who discriminated against me. Implement real diversity and inclusion policies. Make sure this never happens to anyone else. Morrison's facade of professional concern was starting to crack. Ms. Ellington, I understand you're upset, but we can't terminate employees based on one incident without due process. Due process, I repeated. Like the due process you gave me when you decided I didn't belong in first class? The room fell silent again. They were realizing that I wasn't going to be bought off with vouchers and apologies. I was demanding real change, and that scared them. Peterson tried a different approach. Ms. Ellington, if this matter were to become public, it could be damaging for everyone involved. We'd prefer to resolve it quietly and amicably. Are you threatening me? I asked. Not at all, he said quickly. We're simply pointing out that litigation can be expensive and time-consuming for all parties. I laughed, and the sound seemed to echo in the large room. Mr. Peterson, do you know what I do for a living? We understand you're in the logistics business, Morrison said. That's right. I run Ellington Logistics. Do you know what that means? They exchanged glances, clearly unsure where I was going with this. It means I understand how systems work, how organizations function, how power structures operate. I leaned forward. And right now, I'm looking at a system that protects employees who discriminate against customers, that offers training instead of consequences, that tries to buy silence instead of creating change. Sandra was writing furiously. Ms. Ellington, we want to understand your concerns. What would meaningful change look like to you? It would look like leadership that reflects the diversity of your customer base. It would look like policies that have real teeth, not just pretty words in an employee handbook. It would look like a company that values all passengers equally, not just the ones who look like your executives. Morrison was getting defensive now. Ms. Ellington, Meridian Airlines has a strong commitment to diversity and inclusion. We employ people from all backgrounds. In what positions? I asked. How many people of color are in your executive leadership? How many are on your board of directors? The silence that followed was answer enough. Here's what I think happened today, I continued. Your employees saw a young black woman and a middle-aged white man, and they made assumptions about who belonged where. Those assumptions were based on unconscious bias that your company has done nothing to address. And now you're trying to minimize the damage instead of fixing the problem. Peterson was looking increasingly uncomfortable. Ms. Ellington, what would it take to resolve this matter to your satisfaction? I checked my watch. In about 10 minutes, my lawyer would be arriving with the acquisition documents. In about 15 minutes, these executives would learn that the woman they were trying to placate was now their boss. I want a public apology acknowledging that discrimination occurred, I said. I want the employees involved to be terminated. I want a comprehensive review of your diversity and inclusion policies. And I want a commitment to real change, not just cosmetic improvements. Morrison shook his head. That's not realistic, Ms. Ellington. We can't admit to discrimination without a full investigation, and we can't terminate employees without due process. Then we have a problem, I said simply. The tension in the room was palpable. They'd expected to handle this like any other customer complaint, but I wasn't backing down. I wasn't accepting their half measures and empty promises. My phone buzzed with a text from my lawyer, arrived. Ready when you are. I smiled and stood up. Gentlemen, Ms. Mark, I think we need to continue this conversation with additional parties present. Additional parties? Morrison asked. My legal team just arrived. I think you'll find our next discussion much more productive. As I walked toward the door, I could hear them whispering urgently behind me. They thought they were dealing with an angry passenger who was bringing in lawyers to threaten a lawsuit. They had no idea that in about 5 minutes, their entire world was going to turn upside down. Because the woman they'd been trying to silence wasn't just seeking justice for discrimination. She was about to become their new owner. My lawyer, David Kim, walked into the conference room carrying a leather briefcase that contained the most expensive documents in aviation history. Behind him came my CFO, Patricia Williams, and my head of legal affairs, Michael Torres. The Meridian executives looked confused by the sudden influx of people, but they maintained their professional composure. Mr. Morrison, I said, retaking my seat, I'd like you to meet my legal team. We have some additional matters to discuss. Morrison stood and shook hands with each of my colleagues, his expression polite but wary. Of course, though I should mention that our legal counsel is already present. David Kim smiled as he set his briefcase on the table. Actually, Mr. Morrison, I think there's been a misunderstanding about why we're here. A misunderstanding? Peterson, Meridian's legal counsel, looked nervous. Yes, David continued, opening his briefcase with deliberate precision. Ms. Ellington didn't ask us here to discuss the discrimination incident. Well, not primarily. He pulled out a thick folder of documents and placed them on the table. The Meridian executives stared at the papers like they might explode. We're here to finalize the acquisition. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Morrison's face went completely blank. Sandra Mark's pen stopped moving. Peterson looked like he'd forgotten how to breathe. I'm sorry, Morrison said slowly. What acquisition? Patricia Williams leaned forward with a smile that could have cut glass. The acquisition of Meridian Airlines by Ellington Logistics. The $12 billion deal that was approved by your board of directors yesterday. The color drained from Morrison's face so quickly I thought he might faint. That's impossible. The buyer was supposed to be Ivory Ellington, I finished. CEO and majority shareholder of Ellington Logistics. The same Ivory Ellington your employees discriminated against this morning. The same Ivory Ellington you've been trying to silence with vouchers and empty apologies. The silence that followed was deafening. I could actually hear the air conditioning humming, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the rapid breathing of four executives who had just realized their careers were over. Morrison was the first to find his voice. You're the buyer? I am, I said simply. As of 3 p.m. today, I own Meridian Airlines. Every plane, every route, every employee. Including the ones who decided I didn't belong in first class. Sandra Mark made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. Peterson was staring at the acquisition documents like they were written in a foreign language. The head of operations, who hadn't said a word during the entire meeting, looked like he was going to be sick. This is... Morrison started, then stopped, clearly unable to process what he was hearing. Ironic, I suggested. Poetic? The word you're looking for is justice. David Kim began spreading the documents across the table. All the paperwork is in order. The regulatory approvals came through this morning. The funds have been transferred. Ms. Ellington is now the majority owner and chairwoman of Meridian Airlines. Michael Torres pulled out his laptop and opened it. We've also prepared a preliminary report on today's discrimination incident, including witness statements from passengers and a detailed timeline of events. It makes for very interesting reading. Morrison was shaking his head like he could make this all go away through sheer denial. This can't be happening. The board said the buyer was a logistics company. They never mentioned that the CEO was a black woman? I asked. Funny how that detail got overlooked. Patricia Williams consulted her tablet. Actually, Ms. Ellington's identity was clearly stated in all the acquisition documents. Perhaps your team didn't think it was important enough to mention. The implications were sinking in now. These executives had spent the last hour trying to minimize a discrimination incident involving the woman who now controlled their company. They'd offered her vouchers and training programs while she held the power to fire every single one of them. Peterson was frantically flipping through the legal documents. There has to be some kind of mistake. Some procedural error we can challenge. David Kim's smile was razor-sharp. I assure you, Mr. Peterson, everything is completely legal and binding. Ms. Ellington now owns this company, and she has every right to make whatever changes she sees fit. Changes, Morrison repeated weakly. Oh yes, I said, standing and walking to the window that overlooked the city. There are going to be a lot of changes. Starting with the leadership team that allowed today's incident to happen. I turned back to face them, and I could see the fear in their eyes. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't just about a discrimination complaint anymore. This was about accountability at the highest level. You see, gentlemen, Ms. Mark, when your employees discriminated against me this morning, they weren't just insulting a passenger. They were insulting their new owner. When they decided I didn't belong in first class, they were making that decision about the person who now controls their paychecks. Sandra Mark was crying now, actual tears streaming down her face. Miss Ellington, please. We didn't know. If we had known who you were, you would have treated me differently, I finished. And that's exactly the problem. You shouldn't need to know someone's net worth or job title to treat them with basic human dignity. Morrison tried one last desperate play. Miss Ellington, I understand you're upset, but surely we can work together to resolve this professionally. You're a businesswoman. You understand that sometimes mistakes happen. I walked back to the table and placed my hands on its surface, leaning forward to look him directly in the eyes. Mr. Morrison, let me explain something to you. I didn't buy this airline to make money. I already have more money than I can spend in 3 lifetimes. I bought this airline because I believe in the power of transportation to connect people, to create opportunities, to break down barriers. I paused, letting that sink in. But what I experienced today showed me that this company has barriers of its own. Barriers built on prejudice and unconscious bias. Barriers that prevent people like me from being treated with the respect we deserve. Patricia Williams opened her own folder. We've prepared a comprehensive restructuring plan. New leadership, new policies, new training programs that actually have teeth. The kind of changes that will ensure today's incident never happens again. You're firing us, Morrison said. It wasn't a question. I'm replacing you, I corrected. With people who understand that diversity isn't just a buzzword in an employee handbook. It's a business imperative. Michael Torres looked up from his laptop. We've also prepared a public statement about today's incident and the company's commitment to change. It will be released to the media within the hour. Peterson was frantically taking notes. What about severance packages? Transition periods? Surely there are contractual obligations. David Kim pulled out another set of documents, all covered in the acquisition agreement. The new ownership has the right to make immediate leadership changes in cases of discrimination or misconduct. The room fell silent again. The Meridian executives were staring at the table, the walls, anywhere but at me. They were processing the complete destruction of their careers, the public humiliation that was about to follow, the knowledge that their own prejudices had brought this down on them. There is one thing I want you to understand, I said, my voice softer now. This isn't about revenge. This is about justice. This is about making sure that no other passenger ever has to experience what I experienced today. I walked around the table to where Morrison was sitting. When your flight attendant looked at me and decided I didn't belong in first class, she was acting on assumptions that your company culture allowed to flourish. When your staff treated a white man like royalty while ignoring a black woman's basic needs, they were following patterns that your leadership never bothered to address. Morrison looked up at me with hollow eyes. What do you want from us? I want you to learn from this, I said. I want you to understand that actions have consequences. I want you to remember this moment the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on how they look instead of who they are. Sandra Mark was sobbing openly now. Please, Ms. Ellington. I have a family. I need this job. You should have thought about that before you spent an hour trying to cover up discrimination instead of addressing it, I replied. You should have thought about that before you offered me training programs for your employees instead of real consequences for their actions. Patricia Williams checked her watch. The press conference is scheduled for 5 p.m. We'll be announcing the acquisition and the immediate leadership changes. Press conference? Peterson looked panicked. Of course, I said. The public has a right to know when a major airline changes ownership. They also have a right to know about our commitment to equality and inclusion. Michael Torres was typing rapidly on his laptop. The story is already being picked up by the business media. Black female CEO buys airline after discrimination incident. It's going to be front-page news. Morrison put his head in his hands. This will destroy us. No, I said firmly. Your actions destroyed you. I'm just making sure there are consequences. David Kim began gathering the signed documents. The transition team will be here tomorrow morning to begin the changeover. Security will escort the current leadership team out of the building within the hour. The finality of it hit them all at once. Their careers at Meridian Airlines were over. Their reputations in the industry were finished. Their names would forever be associated with the discrimination incident that cost them everything. Miss Ellington, Morrison said quietly, "For what it's worth, I am truly sorry about what happened to you today." I looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Morrison, if you were truly sorry, you would have fired the employees who discriminated against me. You would have implemented real changes instead of offering cosmetic solutions. You would have taken responsibility instead of trying to minimize the damage." I gathered my things and headed for the door. "Your apology might have meant something this morning, but after spending an hour watching you try to cover this up, it's just words." As I reached the door, I turned back one last time. "Oh, and Mr. Morrison? Jennifer Walsh and David Mark, the flight attendants who discriminated against me? They're terminated, effective immediately, along with anyone else who was involved in the incident." The door closed behind me with a soft click, leaving 4 former executives to contemplate the complete destruction of their careers. In the hallway, Patricia Williams was already on her phone with the media relations team. "Yes, we're ready to go live with the announcement. Ivory Ellington, new owner of Meridian Airlines, will be holding a press conference at 5 p.m. to discuss the acquisition and the company's new direction." I smiled as we walked toward the elevator. In 30 minutes, the entire aviation industry would know that the woman who'd been discriminated against on Flight 447 was now the owner of the airline. In an hour, the story would be trending on social media. By tomorrow morning, it would be international news. But more importantly, it would be a message to every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong. Sometimes the person you underestimate is exactly the person who has the power to change everything. The elevator doors opened, and we stepped inside. As we descended toward the lobby, I thought about my grandmother, who'd cleaned houses for people who treated her like she was invisible. She would have loved this moment. Justice, it turned out, was even sweeter when it came with a $12 billion price tag. The press conference was scheduled for 5 p.m., but by 4:30, the lobby of Meridian Airlines headquarters looked like a media circus. News vans lined the street outside, reporters were setting up cameras, and my phone was buzzing with interview requests from every major network. But as I sat in what was now my executive office, reviewing the transition documents, I felt something I hadn't expected: doubt. Not about the acquisition, not about the justice of what had happened, but about the human cost of what I was about to unleash. Patricia Williams knocked on the door and entered with a tablet full of social media updates. "Ivory, you need to see this. The story is already going viral." She showed me the screen. Hashtag Meridian discrimination was trending worldwide. The hashtag justice served was picking up momentum. Videos from passengers on the flight were being shared thousands of times. Someone had even created a meme with my photo and the caption, "When you discriminate against your new boss." "This is bigger than we anticipated," Patricia said. "CNN wants an exclusive. The Today Show is requesting a live interview tomorrow morning. The Wall Street Journal is running a front-page story." I scrolled through the comments on the news articles. Most were supportive, celebrating the poetic justice of the situation. But others were more troubling. People were posting Jennifer Walsh's personal information. Someone had found her home address. Her children's school had been identified. "Patricia, we need to make sure this doesn't turn into a witch hunt," I said. "I want justice, not mob violence." She nodded. "I'll have our security team monitor the situation. But Ivory, you need to understand that this story has touched a nerve. People are seeing it as a symbol of something much bigger than one discrimination incident." She was right. The comments weren't just about what had happened to me. They were about every time someone had been judged by their appearance, every time someone had been told they didn't belong, every time someone had been made to feel less than because of their race or gender or background. My assistant knocked and entered. "Ms. Ellington, there are some people here to see you. They say it's urgent." "Who?" "Jennifer Walsh and David Mark. The flight attendants from this morning." I felt my stomach drop. "They're here? Now. They're in the lobby with security. They're asking for just 5 minutes of your time." Patricia looked concerned. Ivory, you don't have to see them. Especially not right before the press conference. But something in me needed to face them. To look them in the eye and understand how we'd gotten to this point. Send them up, I said. But have security stay close. 5 minutes later, Jennifer Walsh and David Mark were sitting across from me in my new office. Jennifer looked like she'd aged 10 years since this morning. Her eyes were red from crying, her hands were shaking, and she kept glancing around the office like she couldn't believe where she was. David looked equally devastated, but there was something else in his expression. Shame, maybe, or recognition of how badly they'd failed. Miss Ellington, Jennifer began, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for seeing us. I know we don't deserve it. You're right, I said simply. You don't. So why are you here? Jennifer took a shaky breath. I wanted to apologize. Not because I'm trying to save my job, because I know that's impossible now. But because I need you to know that I understand what I did was wrong. Do you? I asked. Do you really understand? I've been thinking about it all day, she said, tears starting to flow again. About how I looked at you and made assumptions. About how I treated you like you didn't matter. About how I would have felt if someone had done that to my daughter. David leaned forward. Miss Ellington, I want you to know that I tried to stop her. When I saw what was happening, I told Jennifer it was wrong. But I didn't try hard enough. I didn't speak up loud enough. I was complicit in what happened to you. I studied their faces, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving desperation. But what I saw was genuine remorse. These weren't evil people. They were flawed people who had acted on unconscious biases and were now facing the consequences. Jennifer, I said, tell me what you were thinking when you decided to move me out of first class. She wiped her eyes with a tissue. I looked at Mr. Pemberton and saw someone who looked like the executives I'm used to serving. Expensive suit, confident demeanor, the kind of person who usually sits in first class. And when I looked at you, you saw someone who didn't fit your expectations, I finished. Yes, she whispered. And I know how horrible that sounds. I know how wrong it was. But in that moment, it felt automatic. Like I was just following some script in my head about who belongs where. That script, I said, is called racism. It might be unconscious, it might be unintentional, but it's still racism. Jennifer nodded, sobbing now. I know, and I'm so sorry. I've been a flight attendant for 15 years, and I've never done anything like this before. But that doesn't excuse it. Nothing excuses it. David spoke up. Miss Ellington, we know we're going to lose our jobs. We know our careers are over. But we wanted you to know that we're going to use this experience to become better people. We're going to make sure our children never make the same mistakes we did. I felt something unexpected. Pity. These people had destroyed their own lives through their prejudices, and now they were sitting in my office, broken and desperate, trying to salvage some dignity from the wreckage. Jennifer, David, I want you to understand something, I said. This isn't just about you losing your jobs. This is about the message we send to every person of color who flies on this airline. This is about making sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. We understand, Jennifer said. And we support whatever changes you want to make. We just wanted you to know that we're truly, deeply sorry for what we did to you. There was a knock on the door. Patricia entered with a concerned expression. Ivory, we need to go. The press conference starts in 10 minutes, and there are some developments you need to know about. I stood up, and Jennifer and David rose as well. Thank you for coming, I said. I hope you learn from this experience. I hope you become the people you should have been all along. As they left, Jennifer turned back one more time. Miss Ellington, for what it's worth, I think you're going to be an amazing owner. This airline is lucky to have you. After they were gone, Patricia filled me in on the developments. The story has exploded beyond anything we anticipated. It's not just about discrimination anymore. It's become a symbol of economic empowerment, of marginalized people taking control of the systems that have oppressed them. She showed me more social media posts. Black women were sharing their own stories of discrimination. People were calling for boycotts of companies with poor diversity records. The hashtag Own Your Power was trending alongside the others. There's something else, Patricia said. We've received calls from 3 other airlines asking about our diversity consulting services. They want to hire us to review their policies and training programs. I smiled despite the weight of the moment. So discrimination is about to become very expensive for the airline industry. Very expensive, she confirmed. But Ivory, there's also a downside. Jennifer Walsh's address has been posted online. Someone threw a brick through her window. Her children are being harassed at school. The smile faded from my face. That's not what I wanted. I know. But once a story like this goes viral, it takes on a life of its own. People are angry and they're looking for targets. I thought about Jennifer's tears, about her genuine remorse, about her children who were now paying for their mother's mistakes. Justice was one thing. Mob violence was another. Patricia, I want you to issue a statement before the press conference. Make it clear that while we support accountability, we don't support harassment or violence against anyone involved in this incident. She nodded. I'll draft something immediately. As we walked toward the elevator that would take us to the press conference, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. In a few minutes, I would stand in front of cameras and tell the world about the discrimination I'd experienced. I would announce the changes I was making to Meridian Airlines. I would become the face of a movement I'd never intended to start. But I would also be responsible for whatever happened next. For the careers that would be destroyed, for the families that would be affected, for the precedent that would be set. The elevator doors opened, and we stepped inside. As we descended toward the lobby full of reporters, I thought about my grandmother again. She'd faced discrimination her entire life, but she'd never had the power to fight back the way I could. Ivory, she'd told me once, power isn't about what you can do to people. It's about what you choose to do for people. The elevator reached the ground floor, and the doors opened to reveal a sea of cameras and microphones. Reporters were shouting questions, photographers were snapping pictures, and security guards were struggling to maintain order. I took a deep breath and stepped into the chaos, knowing that whatever I said in the next few minutes would change not just Meridian Airlines, but the entire conversation about discrimination in corporate America. The woman who'd been told she didn't belong in first class was about to address the world as the owner of the airline. And everyone was watching. The press conference room was packed beyond capacity. Reporters from every major network were there, cameras were rolling live, and the energy in the room was electric. I could see my story trending on the screens of phones and tablets throughout the audience. As I approached the podium, the room fell silent. Every eye was on me. Every microphone was pointed in my direction, and I knew that whatever I said in the next few minutes would be heard around the world. Good evening, I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. My name is Ivory Ellington, and as of this afternoon, I am the majority owner and chairwoman of Meridian Airlines. The room erupted with camera flashes and the rapid clicking of keyboards. I waited for the noise to die down before continuing. I'm here today to address an incident that occurred this morning on Meridian Flight 447 and to announce the immediate changes that will be implemented as a result. I pulled out my phone and placed it on the podium. What I'm about to share with you was recorded during my meeting with Meridian's former executive team this afternoon. I pressed play and the room filled with the voices of Morrison, Peterson, and the others as they tried to minimize the discrimination incident, offering training instead of consequences, vouchers instead of accountability. The reporters were frantically taking notes as they heard Morrison dismiss the incident as a seating mix-up and Peterson suggest that admitting discrimination would be damaging for everyone involved. When the recording ended, the room was silent again. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, what you just heard was the leadership of a major airline trying to cover up racial discrimination. They offered me money to stay quiet. They suggested that going public would be bad for everyone. They refused to acknowledge that their employees had acted on racial bias. I paused, letting that sink in. They had no idea that the woman they were trying to silence was about to become their boss. The room exploded with questions, but I held up my hand for silence. This morning, I boarded Meridian Flight 447 in Seat 2A, which I had paid for. Within minutes of boarding, flight attendant Jennifer Walsh removed me from that seat and gave it to a white male passenger, telling me I would be more comfortable in coach. She made this decision based solely on her assumption that he looked more like someone who belonged in first class than I did. I pulled out a tablet and began reading from the passenger statements my legal team had collected. According to witness testimony, Ms. Walsh then spent the entire flight treating Mr. Pemberton like a VIP while ignoring my basic requests for service. When I asked for a glass of water, she made me wait 20 minutes while she brought him champagne and warm towels. A reporter from CNN raised her hand. Ms. Ellington, how did the airline's executives respond when you confronted them about this? They offered me vouchers, I said simply. They suggested additional training for their employees. They refused to acknowledge that discrimination had occurred, instead calling it a seating mix-up and confusion about passenger priority status. I gestured to the screen behind me, where Patricia was displaying a slide showing Meridian's executive leadership team. As you can see, every single member of Meridian's senior leadership is white. Every single member of their board of directors is white. This is not a company that has prioritized diversity or inclusion. Another reporter called out, "What changes are you implementing?" Effective immediately, I announced, James Morrison, Peterson, Sandra Mark, and the entire senior leadership team have been terminated. They will be replaced by a diverse group of executives who understand that equality isn't just a buzzword in an employee handbook. The room buzzed with excitement as reporters realized they were witnessing corporate history in real time. Additionally, I continued, Jennifer Walsh and David Mark, the flight attendants involved in this morning's incident, have been terminated. However, I want to be clear that while I support accountability, I do not support the harassment or violence that some people have directed toward them and their families. I looked directly into the cameras. Justice is not about destroying people's lives. It's about ensuring that actions have consequences and that change actually happens. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal stood up. Ms. Ellington, some critics might say you're using your wealth to seek revenge rather than justice. How do you respond to that? I smiled. I'd say those critics don't understand the difference between revenge and accountability. Revenge would have been using my power to destroy these people's lives out of spite. Accountability is using my power to ensure that this never happens to anyone else. I clicked to the next slide, which showed the new diversity and inclusion policies we'd be implementing. Starting tomorrow, every Meridian employee will undergo comprehensive bias training. Not the superficial workshops that most companies use, but real, intensive education about unconscious bias and its impact. We're also implementing a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. Another slide appeared showing our new hiring and promotion policies. We're also committing to having leadership that reflects the diversity of our customer base. Within 6 months, at least 40% of our executive positions will be held by people of color. Within a year, our board of directors will be 50% diverse. A reporter from NBC raised her hand. Ms. Ellington, what message do you hope this sends to other companies? I hope it sends the message that discrimination is expensive, I said. That treating people as less than human because of their race or gender or background will cost you more than you can afford. That in 2024, there are consequences for prejudice. I paused, thinking about all the times I'd been underestimated, all the meetings where I'd been the only Black person in the room, all the moments when people had looked at me and seen only what they expected to see. But more than that, I continued, I hope it sends the message that we belong everywhere we choose to be. That success isn't about fitting into other people's expectations, but about changing those expectations entirely. A young black reporter in the front row stood up. Ms. Ellington, what would you say to other women of color who face discrimination but don't have the resources to fight back the way you did? The question hit me hard because it was the most important one of all. Not everyone could buy an airline when they were discriminated against. Not everyone had the power to fire the people who wronged them. I'd say that change doesn't always require wealth or power, I answered. It requires courage. The courage to speak up when you see injustice. The courage to demand better from the companies you support. The courage to believe that you deserve respect regardless of what you look like or where you come from. I looked around the room at all the faces watching me, all the cameras broadcasting this moment around the world. This morning, I was just another passenger who was told she didn't belong. Tonight, I'm the owner of an airline. But the real change isn't in my bank account or my job title. It's in the conversation we're having right now. It's in the policies we're implementing. It's in the message we're sending that discrimination will not be tolerated. A reporter from Fox News called out, Ms. Ellington, some people are saying this is an overreaction to what might have been an honest mistake. How do you respond? I felt a flash of anger, but I kept my voice calm. Sir, when a black woman is removed from her paid seat to make room for a white man, that's not an honest mistake. That's racial bias in action. When airline executives try to cover it up instead of addressing it, that's systemic racism at work. I leaned forward, looking directly at him. The only overreaction would be to let it continue happening. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, but I could see that the story was already being written. The headlines were already being crafted. The narrative was already taking shape. Black CEO buys airline after discrimination incident. From coach to chairwoman, the ultimate revenge story. Ivory Ellington turns discrimination into corporate revolution. As the press conference ended and reporters rushed to file their stories, Patricia approached me with updates from social media. Ivory, the response is incredible. #OwnYourPower is trending in 12 countries. Black women are sharing their own stories of discrimination. Companies are announcing diversity initiatives. You've started something much bigger than just changing one airline. I looked around the room as it emptied, thinking about the journey that had brought me here. This morning, I'd been a successful CEO who thought she was protected from discrimination by her wealth and status. Tonight, I was the face of a movement I'd never intended to start. But maybe that was how real change happened. Not through careful planning or strategic initiatives, but through moments of injustice that became catalysts for transformation. My phone buzzed with a text from my grandmother's best friend, Mrs. Johnson, who was now in her 80s. Baby girl, your grandmother would be so proud. You didn't just get justice for yourself. You got justice for all of us. I smiled as I read the message, thinking about all the women who'd come before me, who'd faced discrimination without the power to fight back, who'd been told they didn't belong and had no choice but to accept it. Tonight, their voices had been heard. Tonight, their dignity had been restored. Tonight, the world had learned that sometimes the person you underestimate is exactly the person who has the power to change everything. As I left the press conference and headed back to my new office, I could see the Meridian Airlines logo being updated on the building's facade. Soon, it would reflect the new direction of the company, the new values we'd be implementing, the new future we'd be building. But the real change wasn't in the logo or the policies or the press coverage. The real change was in the knowledge that discrimination had consequences, that justice was possible, and that sometimes karma came with a $12 billion price tag. The woman who'd been told she didn't belong in first class now owned the entire airline. And everyone was going to remember this story for a very long time. 6 months later, I stood in the same first-class cabin where my journey had begun, but everything was different now. The Meridian Airlines logo had been updated to reflect our new values. The crew was diverse, well-trained, and genuinely committed to treating every passenger with dignity. And the woman conducting the pre-flight safety demonstration was someone who would have been impossible to imagine in the old Meridian, a young black flight attendant named Keisha who spoke with confidence and pride about working for an airline that valued her. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Meridian Airlines Flight 447, she announced. "We're honored to have you with us today, and we want you to know that every passenger on this aircraft is valued and respected equally." I smiled as I listened to her words. That wasn't corporate speak or empty marketing language. That was a promise we'd built into every aspect of our operations. The transformation hadn't been easy. In the weeks following the press conference, we'd faced boycotts from some groups who thought we'd gone too far, criticism from industry leaders who called our changes radical, and skepticism from employees who wondered if the new policies were just for show. But the results spoke for themselves. Customer satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. Employee morale had improved dramatically. We'd been featured on the cover of Harvard Business Review as a case study in corporate transformation. Most importantly, we hadn't had a single discrimination complaint since implementing our new policies. The financial impact had been even more dramatic than I'd expected. 3 major corporations had switched their business travel contracts to Meridian specifically because of our diversity initiatives. 2 other airlines had hired us as consultants to overhaul their own policies. The Ivory Ellington effect, as the business media had dubbed it, was spreading throughout the industry. But the real measure of success wasn't in the numbers. It was in the stories. Like the elderly Latino woman who'd written to thank us after a flight attendant helped her navigate a language barrier with patience and kindness instead of frustration. Like the young Muslim man who'd been treated with respect instead of suspicion when he boarded with his prayer rug. Like the transgender passenger who'd been addressed by their chosen name without question or judgment. Every week, we received letters from passengers who told us that flying Meridian had restored their faith in being treated with dignity. Those letters were worth more than any profit margin. The personal costs had been significant too. Jennifer Walsh had struggled to find work in the airline industry, though she'd eventually been hired by a small regional carrier after completing an intensive diversity training program. She'd sent me a letter 3 months after the incident, thanking me for forcing her to confront her own biases and promising to spend the rest of her career making amends. David Mark had left the airline industry entirely and was now working for a nonprofit that provided bias training to corporations. He'd become one of our most effective advocates, sharing his story at conferences and workshops about the real cost of discrimination. The former executives had faced a harder road. Morrison had been forced to resign from 2 board positions when the story broke. Peterson was still fighting a lawsuit from the State Bar Association. Sandra Mark had moved to a smaller company where she was slowly rebuilding her reputation. I didn't take pleasure in their struggles, but I didn't regret them either. Actions had consequences, and those consequences served as a warning to others who might be tempted to minimize discrimination or cover up injustice. Richard Pemberton, the man who'd benefited from my humiliation, had reached out to me personally. He'd donated $50,000 to a scholarship fund for underrepresented students in business school and had become an advocate for calling out discrimination when he witnessed it. He'd learned that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of complicity. As Flight 447 prepared for takeoff, I thought about how much had changed since that morning 6 months ago. The same route, the same flight number, but a completely different experience for everyone involved. My phone buzzed with a message from my assistant. The documentary crew wants to confirm tomorrow's interview schedule. Also, Oprah's people called again about the special. I smiled and put the phone away. The story had taken on a life of its own, inspiring books, documentaries, and countless articles about the power of turning discrimination into transformation. Harvard Business School was developing a case study. Netflix was producing a limited series. My story had become bigger than just one incident on one flight. But what mattered most to me were the ripple effects I couldn't have anticipated. The young black girl who'd written to tell me that seeing my story had inspired her to pursue her dream of becoming a pilot. The corporate executives who'd reached out to ask for advice on creating truly inclusive workplaces. The other women of color who'd started their own companies after seeing what was possible when you refused to accept other people's limitations. The flight attendant, Keisha, approached my seat with a warm smile. "Miss Ellington, is there anything I can get you for the flight today?" "Just a glass of water, please," I said, remembering how that simple request had been ignored 6 months ago. She returned within minutes with not just water, but a selection of beverages and a warm smile. "Thank you for everything you've done for this company," she said quietly. "My daughter wants to be a pilot now because she sees people who look like her in leadership positions here." After she walked away, I opened my laptop and began working on my speech for tomorrow's conference on corporate diversity. The title was From Discrimination to Transformation: How One Flight Changed an Industry. But as I wrote, I realized the real story wasn't about one flight or one company. It was about the power of refusing to accept injustice, the importance of using privilege and resources to create change, and the truth that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination is simply proving that you belong everywhere you choose to be. My phone rang. It was my grandmother's friend, Mrs. Johnson. "Ivory, baby, I just wanted you to know that I flew Meridian last week to visit my granddaughter in Atlanta." "How was your experience?" I asked. "Honey, they treated me like a queen." The young man who helped me with my bags was so respectful, and the flight attendant made sure I was comfortable the whole time. It reminded me of how things should be. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "I'm so glad, Mrs. Johnson. Your grandmother would be so proud," she continued. "She always said you were going to change the world. She just didn't know you'd start with an airplane." After we hung up, I looked out the window at the clouds below and thought about the journey that had brought me here. 6 months ago, I'd been a successful CEO who thought success would protect me from discrimination. Now I was a symbol of transformation, proof that sometimes the person you underestimate is exactly the person who has the power to change everything. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into our destination. On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for choosing Meridian Airlines, where every passenger matters." As the plane descended, I thought about all the flights I'd take in the future, all the passengers who would be treated with dignity because of what had happened on this route 6 months ago. All the young people who would see possibilities they'd never imagined because someone who looked like them had refused to accept being told they didn't belong. The wheels touched down smoothly, and as we taxied to the gate, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not just because justice had been served, but because real change had been created. The discrimination I'd experienced had been transformed into opportunity for countless others. My phone buzzed with notifications from social media. The hashtag #OwnYourPower was trending again, this time because a young Latina woman had just been promoted to CEO of a major tech company. In her acceptance speech, she'd referenced my story as inspiration to never accept other people's limitations. As I gathered my belongings and prepared to leave the plane, Keisha approached me one more time. "Miss Ellington, I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for the job, but for showing all of us that we don't have to accept being treated as less than. You changed more than just this airline. You changed how we see ourselves." I smiled and squeezed her hand. "You changed yourselves. I just gave you the opportunity." Walking through the airport, I noticed something that would have been impossible 6 months ago: Meridian Airlines advertisements featuring diverse passengers and crew, with the tagline, "Where everyone belongs." The company that had once discriminated against me was now leading the industry in inclusion. But the real victory wasn't in the advertisements or the policies or the press coverage. It was in the knowledge that somewhere, right now, A young person of color was boarding a Meridian flight and being treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. It was in the understanding that discrimination had consequences, that justice was possible, and that sometimes the most powerful response to being told you don't belong is to buy the whole damn place. As I walked toward the exit, my phone rang again. This time it was a reporter from 60 Minutes. Ms. Ellington, we're doing a follow-up story on the changes in the airline industry since your acquisition of Meridian. Would you be available for an interview next week? Of course, I said. But I want to make sure we focus on the future, not just the past. This story isn't over. It's just beginning. Because that was the truth. The discrimination incident on Flight 447 had been a catalyst, but the real work was in building a future where such incidents became impossible. Where young people of all backgrounds could see themselves in positions of leadership. Where respect was given freely, not earned through wealth or status. As I stepped outside into the sunshine, I thought about my grandmother one more time. She'd spent her life cleaning houses for people who treated her as invisible. She'd saved every penny so that I could have opportunities she'd never had. She'd dreamed of a world where her granddaughter would be treated with dignity and respect. She'd gotten something even better, a granddaughter who had the power to create that world for everyone else. The woman who'd been told she didn't belong in first class now owned the airline, had transformed an industry, and had proven that sometimes karma comes with a $12 billion price tag and a legacy that changes everything. And this was just the beginning. Hey everyone, thank you so much for staying with me through this incredible journey. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power we all have to create change, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about justice, transformation, and the beautiful moment when the universe decides to balance the scales. Drop a comment and tell me about a time you witnessed karma in action, or share this story with someone who needs to hear that they belong everywhere they choose to be. Because sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination isn't anger or revenge. Sometimes it's simply proving that you have every right to be exactly where you are. Until next time, remember, never let anyone tell you that you don't belong. And if they do, well, maybe you should just buy the whole place and show them how it's really done. This is Ivory Ellington, reminding you that your worth isn't determined by other people's expectations, and your power isn't limited by their imagination. Keep flying high, everyone. The sky belongs to all of us.